Hi everyone, my name is Anthony Cummins and welcome to this video. Now today we're going to be working on samurai and how they dressed in preparation for death or war, and we are going to use the Book of Samurai series, which is Samurai Arms, Armour and the Tactics of Warfare, and of course Volume 1, which is the Book of Samurai Fundamental Teachings. They are both the words of an actual samurai from the 1600s, and he tells us what is the score with armour and tactics, of course. Now, there's a debate whether samurai tie their cords and sashes to the front, or do they tie them to the back in armour. Now, there's a debate as to which way they go. So what I'm going to do is take you through what we know and how we got there. So this information, if you go into original medieval Japanese, it's probably not that difficult to find. It would just take another team to go and find lots of things. So let's go through what we know. So in the 1600s, we have a man called Isui Sensei, Natori Sanjuro Masazumi, and he's writing for the Kishu clan, and he is a samurai. War master is the word, but he's basically a teacher of war, a teacher of military tactics for war. He is literally the teacher and one of the highest grade ones in this area. So we hope what he says is pretty true. Now he says you should tie your knots at the front because it's in preparation of death. Now, if you don't know, there's lots of ways that the samurai deal with death, preparation for death, understanding death, and this also refers to yin-yang or in-yo. So yang being life, in being death. Sorry, yin being death, so in and yo. Now, what we know is that when a samurai is going to commit seppuku, he traditionally should dress in white, technically. When it's a planned thing, I won't go into that, but they should. There's also a different way to stir or pour, sorry, the sake that you drink beforehand, which is the reverse, okay, which means death. We know from the same manual that when you go to war, you change the direction of your sword to show a direction of in and, well, again, yin and yang, in and yo, to show death and life. We know that. But also he says that you should tie all your knots to the front because this is done as a reversal of peace times. So in peace times, you tie it to your back or at the back, and in war times, you tie them to the front. This is because it's reversed. It doesn't mean normal day life. He's saying the same for sword. He's saying the same for armor. But get this, he even says the same for the weave of your cloth. So if you understand rope work and how a rope is constructed, the same as any 3-ply yarn, if you like, there's left laid and there's right laid. Now what you do is you lay it out, and if it's going left, it's left laid, and if it's going right, it's right laid rope. And the same for yarn. Now there's a left and right for life and death in Japan as well. So not only should your sword be different between yin and yang, life and death, your knots should be at the front for life and death, and the yarn that you actually make your clothes from should be left or right for life or death. Meaning that when you're prepping for seppuku or when you're prepping for war, you are preparing your body for death, okay? You are preparing it for death. Sorry, the dog is running around. Now, if I'm not getting this through, guys, he actually says this in a medieval document. I'll put the picture of the document here. That document tells us this. This is absolutely historical fact that the document exists, and it says this. No way, no problem whatsoever. He also says the costume of death. So once you've tied all your knots, if you're absolutely determined to die in that battle or be victorious, you chop them off. The ends of the cords. It means you can't untie them and tie them again. You are not coming back. This includes your arrow cape, which attaches sometimes to your stirrups. You will chop them off. And of course, there are sections on the bit of the armour here where you can attach them. That's another complex bit where you can and can't attach around this area. But we'll do that another day, hopefully. So, what do we have so far? We have someone from the samurai times telling us that in the old days, for him, which is the war days, they did this for death. It represents death. The weave of their cloth is opposite because it represents death. You dress in white when you do seppuku to represent death. You pour in the opposite way to represent death. You even tie the paper around a wakizashi in the opposite way to represent death. The knots go in a different way to represent death. Are we getting the... Oh, and your sword goes a certain way to represent death. You get the point, guys. It's all about representing death. So, I know that in some books or in some modern English things, it says tie them at the back. Now, I'm not saying this is incorrect, but what I am saying is that there's a tradition that clearly has changed. I personally have never found anything that says you should tie your things at the back. So I asked Miyoko Koizumi, one of my translators on the translation team, and she is a second dan in Yagyu Shinkagi Ryu, so she's a swordswoman. I'll put some pictures up randomly. She is also a gun enthusiast. She shoots Japanese guns for her hobby, if you like, and she is, of course, Japanese. In a Japanese gun society. And not only that, she's a Japanese armor enthusiast. So she owns armor, she dresses in armor, she goes to the events, and she shares her knowledge or talks to everyone else in the Japanese armor community, the modern one. Now, what they say doesn't mean they're right, but this is what I asked her. I said, some people are saying you tie your knots at the back, and she's like, really? That's really strange. You should never tie your armor knots at the back. And I said, why? She said, well, just every group she's ever met, tie them at the front. This is just what the modern Japanese people do. But she says they think, or their theory is that it's because when you go to battle, you can't really reach round and tie and change things. So when you're getting prepped for battle, you've got your chugen, which are your servants or your side assistants as well. And they will dress you for battle. Like a knight has a squire, you get help into your armor, but you tie everything at the front, and their theory is the fact that if you tie it at the front, you can retie it again if it comes loose, or if it's cut, you can then tie with what's left or strap things up and tie at the front. However, Isui Sensei is saying, no, this is for war. So what we've got is Japanese people in the 21st century all tying to the front. And what I'm going to do is show you some pictures in a minute. Miyoko has sent me her this year or late last year in armor in Japan with other Japanese groups, and they all tie to the front. So whatever you've read in modern English books is probably, it may be correct, maybe not correct, but let's ask them, where did you get the information from? What documents did you get it from? And which traditions did you get it from? So they're the questions you have to ask of these modern English books. So what I'm going to do now is show you some pictures of old samurai pictures and Miyoko, and show you knots tied to the front.
Right, guys, just a quick one here. So if you look there, these are at the front, on the legs at the front, middle at the front there, all tied to the front. The guy in the background there, white, tied to the front, legs tied to the front. Then we move on to this guy, middle tied to the front, legs totally tied to the front, just quite obvious there. Right, guys, with these, you can see these are actually old photographs tied to the front, legs tied to the front, the one on the left anyway. And these are from the book I reviewed ages ago, so they're definitely... Also notice the sword is inverted to show going to war, but the other one is the opposite way. But this is definitely from late samurai period. Then this one, again, sword inverted, you can see tied at the front in the waist and at the... Sorry, that was quick. And at the back. Now this one is interesting. It's tied, it's wrapped at the middle but tied at the front. I've put this in for contrast.
So I asked Miyoko, what knots do you tie to the back, if any? And she said, well, actually, there is one which is the under obi, and that goes on top of your kimono, and she says they tie that to the back, just because I think it's too big and it would be in the way. But all other knots, even your hakama, end up at the front. Your kimono, your outer obi is at the front. Your cords at the front. The shin guards are at the front. The helmet, of course, is at the front. Basically, everything knot-wise is at the front. So, and then again, if you're going to be sure that you're going to die in battle or you're going to be victorious, you can cut them into the costume of death, which is even further representative of death. So there you go, guys. We have basically traditions from the 1600s that say samurai weave their clothes in a certain way, tie it to the front. We have old pictures that show, you know, old artwork, if you go back to the Edo period, that show it tied to the front. And you also have modern Japanese people in armour who, to be honest, she was a bit like, who said you tie it at the back? That's strange. She was like, that's strange. You don't tie them at the back. You tie them at the front. Everybody in Japan knows this. You tie it at the front. And that's what she, in her community. That doesn't mean it's right. So what we have to be aware of here is, A, we found it in a 1600s document. Now, we know that Nato-Ryu was actually out of date. It was a school that was out of date for its time, which might sound a bit strange, but actually that's really good for us. I do know from the secret family traditions that it says actually they tried to give lectures in the early 1700s back in Kishu, and that the general the general populace of samurai were a bit disheartened. They were like, oh, it's all stuff our great grandfathers used to do. It's stuff we used to do, which sounds like, oh, that's negative, but no, that's really good, because it means it was the old war stuff, and the new stuff they were doing, which was probably more swordsmanship based, or a little bit more tactical. They were saying, oh, we were more into that, whereas you're telling us how to tie our armor this way for death, and you're, you know, saying we have to do the, you know, the 5 element cycles and all that, whereas you're doing the old stuff. So for us, that's really good, because it tells us that Nato-Ryu actually captured the generations before, meaning that things like going to war, tied to the front, it means death. Pouring your sake, do this. Dress with a cloth of this weave if you're going to do this. All of those things, you know, that were out of date by the time of the 1700s. So what that means is from the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, all the way up to the, you know, the 2000s, you've got change happening. Change. So that's the problem. When you look at these 20th century books that are based on the information coming out of Japan, that is not original information. You've got too much change going on. There's also one other element as well, which is possible, which I still have to do more research on, is maybe when you dress in your armour for a parade, you tie your knots at the back. Maybe that's maybe that is where this idea has come from, because it's going to war. So if you tie your knots at the front and go to war, you're facing death. But if you tie them at the back and maybe you're on parade, maybe it's showing this is a life. This is not, we're not going to battle. So it could really, really honestly be you showing tying your knots at the front and then tying them at the back shows, are you going to war, or are you just going down the street and you're going to the Lord's house and you're an escort or whatever. That has also got to be taken in. Now, there's no documentation for that. Now, the last thing that leaves us with is images. Now, you have to be careful with art. Art is okay to use, but it can't be used on its own. So if you do a spread of, say, 100 images from the earliest time possible, and they all have the, and every single image has tied to the front when in war and tied to the back when in peace, you can pretty much confirm that, okay, there. But as you go later on, further away from war, people start drawing more elaborate things. And if you actually take a look at early 1600s art versus 1800s art in Japan, it's totally different. And you get much, much big figures later on with lavish costumes and lavish armour, which is probably not quite the same as what they actually went to war or battle in, because there's a lot less. They have more protection, basically, in these later images. A lot of the early images, they've got scant protection, unless you're a full-on warrior general. So let me do a very quick roundup, very quickly. What do we have? Documentation from the 1600s that 100% says samurai go dress for death, which means knots at the front, different weave. We know seppuku traditions, dress for death. We know sword traditions, dress for death, or move for in-yo, yin-yang, life and death. We do know that in early art, we start to see images of things tied at the front. We do also, but I haven't checked all art or done a decent work of it. We also know that in modern Japan, people who use and put armour on, which doesn't mean they're right just because they're Japanese. That's a bit racist. Japanese, they must know because they're Japanese. It's the same as me saying I know about English armour because I'm English. You know, it's one of those jobs. But even they say, no, we tie to the front. So we've got this massive slanter. Armour knots are tied to the front. That's all we have. Now, you'd have to find some actual information to say why you think they're tied to the rear, and not just some 20th century English book, actual medieval documentation, because otherwise all of it points to armor in times of war, not peace, is tied to the front. Okay, guys, don't forget, please get yourself a copy. Samurai Arms, Armor and the Tactics of Warfare. This is the Book of Samurai series. You can see it at the top there. That's the logo for it. And we are putting these together, and eventually you should have a massive, long set of information. Okay, guys, thank you very much. Bye-bye.